"This room is paid for until Tuesday," my son said as he placed the motel key in my hand on Mother's Day morning. For a moment I honestly thought he was joking. I stood there beside the faded blue vending machine outside the Bayside Motor Lodge, my overnight bag hanging from my shoulder while the ocean wind tangled my silver hair. The motel sat 3 miles outside Monterey, squeezed between a shuttered bait shop and a gas station with flickering lights. Across the highway, I could see the tops of the luxury beachfront resort where families were gathering for brunch. Jason avoided looking directly at me. He kept adjusting the cuff of his expensive watch, the one I'd helped him buy after his promotion 2 years ago. Brittany stood beside him in oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She smiled at me with that soft, polished expression she used whenever she wanted to disguise cruelty as kindness. "We thought you needed some quiet space, Evelyn," she said gently. "The resort's pretty crowded this weekend." Quiet space. I repeated the words silently in my head, while the motel sign buzzed overhead like a dying insect. 3 months earlier, I had emptied nearly every dollar from my retirement savings to help Jason keep his business alive after a failed investment nearly destroyed him. I told myself that was what mothers did. We stepped in when our children were drowning. We sacrificed quietly and prayed they would someday remember it with love instead of expectation. At 68, I never imagined that helping my family would end with me standing outside a roadside motel, carrying a plastic key card on Mother's Day. "We already checked you in," Brittany continued. "There's complimentary breakfast in the lobby until 10. Complimentary breakfast. The words settled into my chest like cold rain. Jason finally spoke, though his voice sounded strained. "It's only for a couple nights, Mom. We just thought this would be easier." "Easier for who?" I wanted to ask, but I didn't. A black SUV pulled into the resort entrance across the road, and I watched a little girl jump out holding balloons for her grandmother. Families drifted toward the ocean patio dressed in pastel colors, laughing beneath white umbrellas while valet attendants unloaded luggage. Mother's Day. I used to host brunch every year myself. French toast casserole, fresh strawberries, cloth napkins folded into roses because Sophie loved them that way when she was little. Jason used to arrive early just to steal pieces of bacon from the kitchen before everyone else got there. Back then, he still hugged me without hesitation. Brittany glanced toward the resort parking lot, clearly anxious to leave before they were late. "Well," she said brightly, "we should head over before the buffet starts." Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "This really is best for everyone. Best for everyone." Not once did she say best for me. Jason gave me an awkward side hug that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and sea salt. "Love you, Mom," he muttered automatically, already stepping backward toward the car. I stood there holding my bag while they drove away toward the resort entrance. Neither of them looked back. I waited until their SUV disappeared behind the tall hedges before walking slowly toward room 214. Inside, the motel smelled like bleach, old carpet, and stale air conditioning. A single lamp flickered beside the bed. On the dresser sat 2 tiny wrapped soaps and a Bible with torn corners. I placed my suitcase carefully on the chair near the window and pulled the curtains apart just enough to see the distant ocean beyond the highway. Somewhere across the water, families were raising champagne glasses to mothers who were still welcome at the table. That was the moment I realized something that hurt far worse than loneliness. I had not been forgotten. I had been removed. I sat on the edge of the motel bed long after the sound of Jason's SUV disappeared into the afternoon traffic. The mattress dipped unevenly beneath me, and every few seconds the old air conditioner rattled like it was struggling to stay alive. Outside, someone dragged a rolling cooler across the parking lot. A baby cried somewhere near the ice machine. The walls were thin enough that I could hear a television playing a baseball game 2 rooms down. I stared at my phone, waiting for a message that never came. Part of me still believed Jason would text and say there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe they would invite me to dinner after all. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe mothers spent their whole lives making excuses because the truth hurt too much. Around 6 o'clock, sunlight spilled through the faded curtains in long golden strips. Across the highway, the resort balconies glowed warm against the ocean. I could barely make out the music drifting through the evening air. Soft jazz. Laughter. Glasses clinking together. Mother's Day brunch had probably turned into sunset cocktails by now. I imagined Brittany posing for pictures beside the fire pits with her perfect smile, while Jason stood behind her with one hand resting on her shoulder. The image settled heavily in my chest because I knew exactly how those photos would look online later. Happy, effortless, complete, as if I had never existed at all. I opened my purse slowly and pulled out the small gift bag I had packed that morning. Inside was a navy blue sweater for Jason. I had spent nearly an hour choosing it at Macy's last week, because the color reminded me of the sweaters his father used to wear during fishing trips along the coast. There was also a handwritten card for Brittany thanking her for all she does for the family. I almost laughed when I reread those words beneath the motel lamp. My handwriting suddenly looked foolish. Weak. I placed the card back inside the bag and folded the tissue paper carefully over it. At 7:15 my phone finally lit up. My heart jumped before I even looked down. But it was only a bank fraud alert asking me to confirm a charge from a seafood restaurant in Monterey. $78.40. Jason and Brittany must have used the business card account I still co-signed for him years ago. I pressed confirm without hesitation. Then I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it again. The motel room grew darker as the evening settled in. I walked to the window and watched headlights move along the highway like distant streams of light. Somewhere out there families were gathering around dinner tables telling stories and passing around desserts while mothers smiled across candlelight. I used to believe my family would always come back to me eventually, no matter how distant things became, no matter how distracted life made them. But standing there alone in room 214 with the smell of bleach and salt air lingering around me, I began to understand something painful. Distance does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, one ignored phone call at a time. One missing invitation at a time. Until one day, the people you built your life around can leave you in a motel without even realizing how cruel it feels. I barely slept that night. The motel pillows smelled faintly of detergent and something older underneath, something tired. Around 2 in the morning, a motorcycle roared through the parking lot, followed by loud laughter outside my door. I sat upright in bed, clutching the blanket against my chest until the noise faded. After that, I left the television on low volume just to fill the silence. In the early morning, pale gray light slipped through the curtains, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then the buzzing motel sign outside reminded me. I walked slowly to the bathroom sink and stared at my reflection beneath the harsh fluorescent light. My silver hair looked thinner than I remembered. There were dark shadows beneath my eyes that no amount of powder could hide anymore. Aging sneaks up quietly like that. One day you still feel like the mother who keeps everything together. The next day, people start discussing what to do with you as if you are furniture that no longer fits the room. Down in the lobby, the complimentary breakfast consisted of powdered eggs, weak coffee, and individually wrapped muffins stacked beside a plastic bowl of bruised apples. A little boy wearing dinosaur pajamas smiled at me, while his mother poured orange juice into a paper cup. "Happy Mother's Day," she said warmly as she passed my table. I smiled back and thanked her, but the words caught painfully in my throat after she walked away. It struck me then that strangers had shown me more kindness in 12 hours than my own family had all weekend. Back upstairs, I sat near the window with my coffee and watched the coastal fog roll slowly across the highway. My phone remained silent. No missed calls. No invitations. Around noon, I finally opened Facebook. I do not know why I tortured myself that way. Maybe some part of me still hoped to see evidence that I mattered to them. Instead, the first photo nearly stopped my breathing. Brittany stood beside the resort pool in a flowing white dress with one arm around Jason, while Sophie smiled beside them holding a plate of pancakes covered in strawberries. The caption read, "Perfect Mother's Day getaway with the people who matter most." Beneath it were dozens of comments from friends calling them beautiful, blessed, and inspiring. I looked at the photo for a very long time. Not because I was angry. Anger would have felt warmer somehow. What I felt instead was colder. It was the realization that this had not been impulsive cruelty. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Deliberately. Suddenly other memories returned with painful clarity. Last Thanksgiving, Brittany insisted it would be less stressful if I stayed at a nearby hotel because the guest room was being renovated. 2 months before that, Jason forgot my birthday for the first time in his life and blamed work deadlines. Even Christmas morning had changed. Brittany began scheduling brunch with her parents first, pushing our traditions later and later each year until eventually they disappeared altogether. At the time, I told myself families changed as children grew older. I thought loneliness was simply part of aging. But sitting there beside the motel window while ocean fog swallowed the highway, I began to understand something far worse. They had not slowly drifted away from me. They had been making room for a life that no longer included me at all. By late afternoon, the motel room had started to feel smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves were slowly pressing inward. I turned off the television and sat quietly beside the window listening to the distant sound of waves beyond the highway. The ocean used to calm me. Harold and I spent nearly every anniversary driving up the California coast with a cooler full of sandwiches and an old jazz station playing through the car speakers. He always said the sea reminded him that nothing painful stayed still forever. I wished he had been right about that. Around 4 o'clock, I found myself thinking about the last time Jason had cried in front of me. It was 18 months earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with both hands covering his face while unpaid invoices and bank notices were spread across the placemats. His business partner had disappeared after a bad investment, leaving Jason responsible for debts he could not manage alone. I still remembered the exhaustion in his eyes that night. "I do not know what else to do, Mom," he had whispered. "We could lose everything." At the time, helping him did not even feel like a decision. It felt automatic. Maternal instinct does not disappear simply because your hair turns gray. The next morning, I drove to the bank and emptied most of the retirement account Harold and I spent 40 years building together. I sold my diamond anniversary bracelet 2 weeks later without telling anyone. Even the wedding ring I promised myself I would never remove eventually disappeared into a velvet tray beneath bright jewelry store lights, while a young cashier avoided meeting my eyes. Jason hugged me afterward in the parking lot so tightly I could barely breathe. "I will never forget this," he said over and over again. "I swear I will take care of you one day." I believed him completely. That is the dangerous thing about love when it comes from a parent. It does not ask for contracts or guarantees. It survives almost entirely on memory and hope. First, things did improve after the business recovered. Jason called more often. Brittany even invited me over for Sunday dinners once or twice a month. But slowly, subtle changes began slipping into place like furniture being rearranged in the dark. My framed photographs disappeared from the hallway shelves. The guest room where I kept extra clothes was converted into Brittany's home fitness studio, without anyone asking how I felt about it. One afternoon, I overheard Brittany telling a friend on the patio, "Older people are happier when they have less responsibility." At the time, I convinced myself she meant well. Now I understood those words differently. Less responsibility, less space, less presence, less importance. Piece by piece, they had been reducing me long before the motel. My phone buzzed suddenly on the nightstand, pulling me back to the present. For one hopeful second, I thought it might finally be Jason. But it was only a notification from Brittany's social media page. Another photograph. This time the entire family sat around a candlelit dinner table overlooking the ocean while Sophie smiled beneath string lights. Jason had his arm around Brittany's shoulders. Everyone looked relaxed, comfortable, whole. I stared at the image until one painful realization settled quietly into my chest. Nobody at that table looked like they were missing me. Rain started sometime after sunset, tapping softly against the motel window in uneven rhythms. I sat at the small table near the bed with a paper cup of cold coffee between my hands, listening to the storm move across the coast. The room smelled damp now. The old carpet carried the faint odor of mildew whenever the air conditioner shut off. I should have tried to sleep, but something restless had settled inside me. Not anger exactly. More like the slow ache of finally seeing something clearly after years of refusing to look directly at it. Around 9:30 there was a soft knock at my door. First I froze. Hardly anyone knew where I was staying. The knock came again, quieter this time. When I opened the door, Sophie stood there clutching the hood of a gray sweatshirt tightly around her face. Her long blonde hair was damp from the rain, and her eyes widened with relief the moment she saw me. "Grandma," she whispered before stepping inside quickly. The motel room suddenly felt warmer with her there. Sophie had always carried kindness gently, almost cautiously, as if she was afraid too much softness might embarrass the people around her. At 16, she already noticed far more than adults realized. She glanced around the room slowly, taking in the faded curtains, the flickering lamp, the untouched blanket folded near the pillow. "I cannot believe they left you here," she said quietly. I tried to smile. "It is only for a few days." But even to my own ears, the words sounded weak now. Sophie sat at the edge of the bed, twisting her sleeves nervously around her fingers. "Mom told everyone you wanted privacy," she said after a long silence. "She said you were tired and needed quiet time alone." I looked down at the cold coffee in my hands. Privacy. Quiet time. The lies always sounded so thoughtful when Brittany told them. Sophie hesitated before speaking again. "Grandma, there is something else." Her voice grew smaller then, uncertain. "Last week, I heard Mom and Dad talking in the kitchen after they thought I went upstairs." A strange heaviness settled into my chest. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the ocean. "What did they say?" I asked carefully. Sophie swallowed hard. "Mom wants Dad to sell your house eventually. She said it does not make sense for someone your age to live alone anymore." The words landed softly but painfully, like stones dropping into deep water. Harold's house. The little white colonial with blue shutters where we raised Jason. The kitchen where birthday cakes cooled beside open windows every summer. The front porch where Harold used to read newspapers every Sunday morning with black coffee balanced beside his chair. I had not even realized Brittany thought of it as available. "Dad did not say much," Sophie continued quietly. "But he did not argue either." I closed my eyes for a moment. Somehow that hurt worse. Not cruelty. Not shouting. Just silence. Sophie reached across the table then and wrapped her hand around mine. "I told them it was wrong," she whispered. "I really did." I looked at my granddaughter sitting beneath the weak motel lamp with rainwater still clinging to her sleeves, and for the first time all weekend, something inside me softened instead of broke. Because even after everything else had faded away, at least one person still saw me as family. Sophie stayed for nearly an hour that night. We sat quietly most of the time, listening to the rain strike the motel window while cars hissed through puddles along the highway outside. She told me about school. About a history project she was nervous to present next week. About how she wanted to study marine biology someday because the ocean made her feel calm. I listened carefully to every word because I realized how long it had been since anyone in the family simply talked to me without rushing or checking a phone halfway through the conversation. Before leaving, Sophie hugged me tightly near the door. "Please do not let them make you feel unwanted," she whispered. Then she pulled her hood over her hair and disappeared back into the rain toward the resort parking lot across the highway. After she left, I stood there for a long time staring at the empty doorway. Something had shifted quietly inside me during that conversation. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a small but permanent crack in the version of reality I had protected for years. I finally understood that I had spent too much of my life begging for scraps of affection from people who only valued what I could provide. That realization followed me into the next morning. Monday arrived gray and cold, with low clouds hanging over the coastline like heavy wool blankets. The motel parking lot smelled of wet pavement and cigarette smoke. I packed my suitcase slowly while the coffee maker hissed beside the sink. My phone remained silent except for advertisements and weather alerts. Jason still had not called. Not once. I noticed then that I no longer felt surprised by it. That was the part that frightened me most. Disappointment had quietly become expectation. Around 10 o'clock, I walked down to the lobby and extended my stay another 3 nights. The young clerk behind the counter gave me a sympathetic smile while typing on the computer. "No problem, ma'am," he said gently. "Would you like the same room?" Same room. Same thin walls. Same flickering lamp. I nodded anyway. Then I walked back upstairs carrying the fresh key card in my hand, and suddenly stopped halfway down the outdoor corridor. Across the street, the resort valet attendants were loading luggage into expensive SUVs, while families prepared to leave after the holiday weekend. For a brief moment, I imagined walking over there and demanding answers. Pictured Brittany lowering her sunglasses with fake concern while Jason avoided my eyes beside her. But just as quickly the urge disappeared. I was tired of forcing people to explain kindness they clearly did not feel. Back in room 214, I opened my purse and removed the worn leather folder where I kept copies of financial documents, retirement statements, property records, bank accounts, loan paperwork from when I helped Jason save his company. I spread everything carefully across the small motel table beneath the buzzing lamp. Harold always handled most financial matters before he passed away. But he taught me enough to understand one important thing. Nothing about money is ever accidental. My eyes paused on one particular document carrying both my signature and Jason's. A secured loan agreement tied partially to the equity in my home. Slowly, I sat back in the chair while rainwater slid quietly down the motel window beside me. For the first time since arriving there, I no longer felt like a helpless old woman abandoned by her family. I felt alert, careful, awake, and somewhere deep beneath the sadness, something colder had finally begun to grow. The rain finally stopped sometime during the night, leaving the air outside sharp with salt and cold morning fog. I barely noticed. I spent most of Tuesday sitting at the motel table surrounded by papers while room 214 slowly filled with the smell of stale coffee and damp air. The secured loan agreement remained directly in front of me the entire time. I read every line carefully now, not as a mother trying to save her son, but as a woman trying to understand exactly what had been done with her trust. Around noon, I called the law office Harold used for nearly 30 years. I expected voicemail or some unfamiliar receptionist who would not remember me. Instead, a calm older voice answered on the second ring. Bennett and Associates. The sound nearly made my chest tighten with relief. This is Evelyn Carter, I said quietly. I was Harold Carter's wife. There was a brief pause before his tone softened immediately. Mrs. Carter. Of course. This is Daniel Bennett. I closed my eyes for a moment after hearing his name. Daniel had handled our estate planning years earlier. He attended Harold's funeral in a dark gray suit and stood beside me afterward while everyone else discussed casseroles and flower arrangements. I need help understanding some documents, I told him carefully. Would it be possible to meet today? By 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from Daniel in his small office overlooking downtown Monterey. The room smelled faintly of leather books and cedar polish. Family photographs lined one shelf beside legal binders worn soft at the corners from years of use. Daniel adjusted his glasses slowly while reviewing the loan paperwork I placed in front of him. The silence stretched long enough to make my stomach tighten. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me. Evelyn, he said carefully, does Jason believe this debt was forgiven? I hesitated. I assumed it eventually would be. Daniel folded his hands together. Legally, it was never forgiven. Harold structured this as a protected secured loan tied partially to your property trust. In the event of default, control remains entirely with you. I stared at him without speaking. Outside the office window, gulls drifted slowly above the marina beneath low gray clouds. There is more, Daniel continued gently. He opened another folder carrying Harold's signature across the bottom. Your husband amended the family trust 6 months before he passed away. My heartbeat slowed strangely then, almost too calm. Why? Daniel gave me a long, knowing look before answering. Because he was worried you would someday confuse love with obligation. The room grew very quiet after that. Suddenly I remembered Harold sitting alone at the kitchen table one evening years ago, while Brittany laughed too loudly about expensive vacations Jason could not afford. At the time, Harold said only one sentence afterward. Kindness should never become permission. I had not understood what he meant back then. Now I finally did. Daniel slid the paperwork carefully across the desk toward me. As things stand right now, he said softly, your son owns far less than he thinks he does. I looked down at the documents resting beneath my hands and felt something unfamiliar settle quietly inside me. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Just clarity, cold and undeniable. I returned to the motel just before sunset with Daniel's folders resting beside me on the passenger seat like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The coastal fog had lifted, leaving the ocean sharp and silver beneath the evening light. For the first time all week, I rolled the car windows down during the drive back. The cold air cleared something inside my head that grief and humiliation had kept clouded for too long. Room 214 looked exactly the same when I opened the door. The flickering lamp, the faded bedspread, the faint smell of bleach lingering beneath the air conditioner. But somehow the room no longer felt like punishment. It felt temporary. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I placed the folders carefully on the table and sat down beside them while traffic moved steadily along the highway outside. Then, for the first time since Mother's Day, my phone began vibrating across the tabletop. Jason. I watched his name appear on the screen until the call stopped. Seconds later, another one came. Then another. By the fourth call, I finally answered. "Mom," he said immediately, his voice tight with panic. "Why is the bank freezing part of the business account?" I remained quiet for a moment, listening to the strain underneath his words. In the background, I could hear Brittany talking rapidly to someone else. "I reviewed the loan documents," I said calmly. Silence. Then Jason exhaled sharply. "Mom, come on. This is not the time for legal technicalities." Legal technicalities? I looked slowly around the motel room while he spoke. The peeling wallpaper. The stained curtains. The loneliness they had delivered me into without hesitation. "You signed those documents too, Jason," I replied softly. "You knew what they were." "That was years ago," he snapped before lowering his voice again. "We were under pressure back then." I almost smiled at that. Pressure. Such a clean word for desperation. "And now?" I asked quietly. Another silence stretched between us. This one heavier. Brittany's voice suddenly cut through the background louder now. "Tell her she is overreacting. We did not do anything wrong." I heard every word clearly. Jason must have realized it too because his voice dropped into an embarrassed whisper. "Mom, Brittany did not mean." "I know exactly what Brittany means," I interrupted gently. The line went silent again. Somewhere outside my motel room, gulls cried over the coastline while headlights drifted past in slow streams beyond the window. Finally Jason spoke again, sounding smaller somehow. "Younger. What do you want me to do?" That question settled heavily inside me because for years I would have answered immediately. I would have rushed to fix things, smooth things over, protect him from consequences before he even understood them himself. But exhaustion changes people. So does clarity. "Nothing," I said quietly. "I am tired of teaching grown people how to treat me." Before he could answer, I ended the call and placed the phone face down beside the legal folders. A few minutes later, another message appeared from Brittany. "We need to discuss this as a family." I stared at the words for a long moment before locking the screen again. Family. Strange how people suddenly remembered that word whenever money became uncertain. 3 weeks later, I moved into a small cottage overlooking the northern edge of Monterey Bay. The house was nothing extravagant. White siding, blue shutters, a narrow wooden porch just wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a pot of lavender beside the steps. But every morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows in long golden lines, and at night I could hear the distant sound of waves rolling against the shore. Peace does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it comes quietly, disguised as ordinary silence. Daniel handled most of the legal work after our meeting. The trust remained under my control exactly as Harold intended, and once the business accounts were reviewed properly, Jason's financial situation became painfully clear. He had overextended the company again without telling me. Brittany had continued spending as if success could somehow outrun debt forever. Expensive vacations, luxury furniture, designer handbags, displayed online beside smiling captions about gratitude and blessings. Appearances are expensive things to maintain, especially when they are built on borrowed money. Jason called several more times during those first weeks, but I stopped answering immediately. Not to punish him, simply because I no longer felt responsible for rescuing him from every uncomfortable consequence in his life. There is a difference between love and self-erasure. It took me nearly 70 years to learn that. One Thursday evening, Sophie came to visit after school carrying clam chowder from a little seafood cafe near the marina. We sat together on the porch wrapped in blankets while fog drifted slowly over the water below. She talked about college applications and marine biology programs along the coast while I listened with the kind of calm I thought I had lost forever. Before leaving, she hesitated near the front door. "Dad moved into a hotel last week," she said quietly. I looked up from my tea but did not respond right away. "Mom is furious about the business situation," Sophie continued carefully. They fight all the time now. I nodded slowly. Strange how quickly people turn against each other once money stops protecting the cracks already underneath. Your father is not a bad man, I said after a long silence. But sometimes weak people mistake comfort for character. Sophie thought about that quietly before hugging me goodbye. A few days later, Jason finally appeared at my cottage unannounced. I saw his car pull into the gravel driveway just after sunset. He looked older when I opened the door. Tired. His expensive jackets no longer fit him the same way confidence once had. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward the ocean behind me. It is beautiful here, he said softly. Yes, I answered. It is peaceful. He lowered his head after that, and for the first time in years I saw genuine shame in his face instead of defensiveness. Mom, he said quietly, I do not know how everything became so broken. I studied him carefully beneath the porch light while cold evening air moved through the lavender beside the steps. Then I answered with the truth. I had finally learned inside that motel room weeks earlier. Things usually break slowly long before anyone hears the sound. Jason began crying then, not loudly, not dramatically, just the exhausted tears of a man finally forced to confront himself without excuses left to hide behind. I did not rush to comfort him this time. I simply stood beside the ocean listening to the waves roll against the shore, while the night settled gently around us. Because forgiveness and rescue are not always the same thing. And sometimes the greatest kindness a mother can offer her child is finally allowing him to face the life he created on his own.